Now let's talk a little bit more about racial inequalities that were happening in the 1930s. All right, so first you have massive amounts of unemployment in the African American community throughout the United States. So you have African Americans with the highest rates of unemployment. And why is that? Due to discriminatory hiring practices, right? So you have white employers who simply refused to hire African Americans. Even government agencies, right? We were talking about the New Deal agencies that were created to give Americans jobs. And yeah, millions of Americans did get jobs, but there were some government agencies that refused to hire African Americans, right? So what was the result? Well, you have a number of African American families who came to depend on the welfare programs to get by, right, for public assistance. And then you have a backlash from others in the United States, right, mostly conservatives, who are going to criticize the welfare system, right, saying, oh, there's all these people who aren't even working, they're not contributing to unemployment, but yet they're receiving benefits, right, they're receiving money, right? And so you have this whole issue surrounding the welfare system that arises around that time, and it's going to continue on and on for decades. Okay, this whole argument about welfare and whether it's right or not. Okay, you also have housing discrimination going on in the 1930s during the Depression. Remember, a lot of people are homeless, right? A lot of people lost their homes, and so the government is trying to encourage people to buy homes. They want to build homes. The government itself is building homes. They want, so basically you have the government insuring loans for housing, but the government would often refuse to give loans to African American neighborhoods for homes that were in African American neighborhoods or in racially integrated neighborhoods, right? Whereas a neighborhood like a mixed neighborhood, right? And so, just another form of racial inequalities, this time, of course, by the federal government. And also some of the mortgages that did get signed, they contain clauses that denied sales to non-whites, okay? So it's like it's written in the contract that the home cannot be sold in the future to people who aren't white because they're trying to maintain white neighborhoods. Okay, so basically you have the federal government contributing to segregation during the 1930s. Okay, so what about Mexican migrants during the Great Depression? Well, you have a number of Mexican immigrants who actually migrated back to Mexico during the Great Depression because there's no work available, right? And the fact that migrant workers were ineligible for state and federal financial assistance programs, right? Why? Because you had to prove residency in order to be eligible for state programs and federal programs to get financial aid, okay? And so since you have a number of Mexican migrants who were agricultural workers, they were moving around from one location to another and never stayed long enough to establish residency in one place. So they couldn't get federal relief. There were no jobs available because you have a number of Anglo-Americans who now want to be low-paid agricultural workers, right? Where before they may have shied away from that job, but now that there's no work at all, you have Anglo-Americans who are trying to get those jobs. So there's competition there. So that's why you have a number of Mexican migrants and their children who may be Mexican American because they were born in the States, migrating back to Mexico during this time. Remember we had talked about Filipino immigration and how the United States was trying to limit Filipino immigration. 1935, you have the Filipino Repatriation Act, which is trying to do just that. Okay, so the U.S. is concerned about the high levels of Filipino migration coming to the country, right, in the continental United States. And so the government is encouraging Filipinos to move back to the Philippines, and they're going to pay all of their travel expenses. And so you see this idea of trying to racially engineer the country there. It's coming from the federal government. Okay, what about Native Americans during the Great Depression? Well, for Native Americans, they got the Indian New Deal. Okay, the Indian New Deal. So before the 1930s, the policy of the federal government was to force Native Americans to assimilate to American culture. Okay, so now you're going to see a reversal, right? So things are going to change in that sense, which could be a good thing for Native Americans, although there's still economic struggles on the reservations. But there is a sense to try to preserve Native American culture. So let's talk about the Indian New Deal. What does it do? Well, under the Indian New Deal, you start to see the building of schools, local schools on the reservations. And this is different from the boarding schools because I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but Native American children were taken from their parents and forced to leave the reservation and go to boarding schools, right? Which in some cases could be like military style boarding schools. But either way, there's very strict discipline at the boarding schools. And it's not just strict discipline, but it's a concerted effort to force Native Americans to assimilate to American society and leave behind their culture. Okay, so for example, if a Native American student is forced to go to these boarding schools, they're going to be forced to cut their hair. Okay, they got to cut their hair. They got to change the way that they dress, their traditional dress. They can't speak their language. If they speak their language, they're going to be punished. Right? In fact, if they practice any aspect of their culture, they'll be punished because there is a concerted effort to destroy Native American culture, right? But when we get to the 1930s, you start to see a little shift there in the federal Indian policy. Okay, so now schools are being built on the reservation, so children don't have to leave their family or leave their community and be taken away from their culture, right? So that's one aspect of it. Also, you have the Indian Reorganization Act as part of the Indian New Deal. So the Indian Reorganization Act, this is going to recognize the self-determination of Native American tribes, right? What does that mean? It means that tribes are going to be considered sovereign nations once again, okay? That means they have the right to govern themselves in any way they like. They make decisions that concern politics, their economy, preservation of their culture, right? And so the Indian Reorganization Act is going to create Native American governments, right, based on the U.S. government. So Native American tribes have to, create a constitution. They have to elect officials, and so in a sense, it's kind of forcing American-style politics on Native Americans, which could be an issue because that may go against the traditional government of Native Americans. They have to be, like the United States and assimilate to that form of government. But then again, it's also recognizing tribes as sovereign nations, and with sovereignty comes a lot of rights and a lot of control over the reservations, right? So a little give and take there. Either way, Native American reservations experienced extreme poverty during the Great Depression, but these acts that were passed as part of the Indian New Deal would benefit Native American societies in the future, especially in terms of issues related to sovereignty.